The year was 1888. The month was November. He stood on the porch of the house her hands had helped build, and pointed toward the grey horizon. The wind had a blade in it, a promise of the first hard freeze that would lock the world in its fist until April. Abigail Hale stood on the frozen dirt of the yard, holding a single burlap sack. Inside, the weight of a cast-iron skillet and her mother's worn Bible pressed against her thigh. Beside her, the great black and tan shepherd, Fenrir, did not bark. He stood silent, a low growl vibrating in his chest, a sound felt more than heard. The air was 5 degrees above freezing and dropping. The cold did not care about the piece of paper in her brother-in-law's hand. It did not care about justice, or grief, or the fact that her husband was not yet 5 months in the ground. Her brother-in-law, Marcus, let the paper fall from his fingers. It skittered across the porch like a dead leaf. He looked at her, his face a mask of grim righteousness, a man performing a duty he had convinced himself was necessary. "The law says this is mine now," he said, his voice thin against the wind. "A woman and a dog have no claim." She did not answer. She turned her back on the only home she had ever known and began to walk. As she passed the dilapidated stone wall that marked the edge of the property, her boot heel scraped against something hard in the dirt. She bent down, her fingers numb, and pulled a small object from the frozen earth. It was a bone needle, intricately carved, smoothed by time and use. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. She slipped it into her pocket, a small, secret weight against the vast emptiness ahead. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from in the world. We read every one. Abigail had always been a student of things that other people merely used. While other women learned the rhythms of the kitchen, she learned the rhythms of the earth. Her husband, Thomas, had been a good man, but a simple one. He farmed by the calendar. Abigail farmed by the clouds, by the feel of the soil in her hand, by the way the wild chicory flowers closed before a rain. She had read his agricultural almanacs not as instruction, but as conversation. She would sit by the fire in the evenings, the book open in her lap, and murmur quiet disagreements with its author. She knew their small parcel of land in western Nebraska with an intimacy that unsettled the neighbors. She knew the low spot in the north pasture held water too long for corn but would be perfect for rice grass. She knew the stand of aspens on the ridge meant the water table was high there, a good place to dig a new well when the old one ran shallow in August. This knowledge was not welcome. It was seen as an intrusion, a quiet overstepping of the boundaries that kept the world in order. Men would come to speak with Thomas about planting, and Abigail, sitting quietly mending a shirt, would offer a suggestion. "The soil on that slope is too sandy for wheat, Mr. Henderson. It will need manure." The men would fall silent, looking at Thomas, their faces tight with a discomfort they could not name. It was the discomfort of a man who realizes the tool he is holding is smarter than he is. Thomas would clear his throat and change the subject. He loved her, but he did not understand her. He saw her wisdom as a strange and beautiful complication in a life that was supposed to be simple. The rejection was not a single act, but a slow, steady pressure, like water seeping into rock. It was in the way the other women would stop talking when she joined their circle at the general store. It was in the averted eyes of the men who had once sought Thomas's advice. After the fever took Thomas in the summer, that pressure became a vice. Marcus arrived from back east, a man who had only ever seen land as lines on a map. He saw the farm not as a living thing, but as an asset. And he saw Abigail as a liability. She was a widow with no children, a woman who spoke of soil pH and weather fronts. The world had no category for her. She was supposed to be a dependent, a quiet burden to be housed in an attic room until she could be married off to another farmer. The local preacher, a man with soft hands and a hard certainty, had visited shortly after the funeral. He had sat in her parlor, sipping tea, his eyes cataloguing the books on her shelf. "A woman's mind should tend to the hearth, Mrs. Hale," he had said, his voice gentle but firm. "Not the earth." It courts misfortune, it was not a warning. It was a verdict. Marcus had listened to these whispers. He saw her knowledge not as a resource to be used, but as a silent judgment on his own ignorance. He watched her walk the fields, her dog at her side, and saw not a grieving woman tending her husband's legacy, but a rival staking a claim. He needed to be the master of the land, and he could not be master while she was there, her quiet competence a constant reminder of all he did not know. The first cold snap of November was the excuse he needed. He invoked the law, the one written by men for men, and declared her presence on the farm to be over. He gave her 1 day to pack. She did not pack. She took the skillet, the Bible, and the dog, and walked away from a world that had mistaken her gift for a flaw. She was walking toward nothing, but she was also walking away from the slow death of being misunderstood. The first night, she found a shallow ravine sheltered by a cluster of gnarled cottonwoods. The temperature dropped into the teens. She pulled her thin wool coat tight, wrapping her arms around Fenrir, his thick fur a small furnace against the biting cold. The dog whined softly, pressing his body against hers, a silent question in the dark. "Where are we going?" She had no answer. Sleep did not come. It was replaced by a shivering that started in her jaw and worked its way down her spine, an uncontrollable tremor that shook her to the core. This shivering, she knew from the almanacs, was a good sign. It was the body fighting, burning what little fuel it had to stay alive. The danger would come when the shivering stopped. By the third day, the last of her hardtack was gone. Hunger was a dull, constant ache in her stomach, a hollow feeling that made the world seem distant and unreal. She walked for miles, following the faint trace of a frozen creek, her eye scanning the barren landscape for any sign of shelter, any break in the monotonous brown and gray of the plains. The wind was relentless. It found every gap in her clothing, every small weakness, and drove the cold deep into her bones. Her fingers went from a burning ache to a waxy numbness. She could no longer feel her toes. At one point, she stumbled, her legs clumsy and unresponsive. She lay in the brittle grass for a long time, the grey sky spinning above her. It was in that moment she considered giving up. The thought was not dramatic. It was quiet and reasonable. She could simply lie here. The cold would do its work. It would be a kind of sleep. She thought of the warm kitchen she had left behind, the smell of baking bread, the feel of a thick quilt. She even thought of the bland oatmeal Marcus's wife served for breakfast, a food she had always disliked. Now, the memory of its simple warmth was an almost unbearable comfort. This is where her story could end. A footnote in a county ledger. A woman lost to the prairie. But then a warm, wet tongue dragged across her frozen cheek. Fenrir nudged her face with his nose, a low, insistent whine coming from deep in his throat. He would not let her rest. He was a practical problem. He was thirsty. He was hungry. He was alive, and his life was tied to hers. The body acted before the mind caught up. She pushed herself up, first to her elbows, then to her knees. The world tilted violently. She crawled toward the creek bed, breaking a thin sheet of ice with the butt of her hand to get to the frigid water below. The water was so cold it felt like fire in her throat, but it was life. She followed the creek, not with any destination in mind, but because it was a line in a world that had become shapeless. She noticed something. A line of juniper trees, their dark green a stark defiance against the dead landscape. Junipers, she knew, were survivors. Their roots ran deep, seeking stability and water where other trees could find none. She followed the line of them as if they were a map. They led her up a gentle rise, a small hill that offered a view of nothing but more prairie. But at the crest, she saw it. A depression in the earth. A rectangular hollow, where the earth had sunk. It was an old root cellar, the kind early settlers built before they had the time or lumber for a proper house. The roof, likely made of sod and timber, had long ago collapsed, leaving a gaping hole to the sky. The entrance was a set of crumbling stone steps leading down into darkness. It was a grave. It was a wound in the earth. To anyone else, it would have been a ruin. To Abigail, it was a foundation. She walked to the edge of the hole and looked down. The walls were stone, rough-hewn but solid. They went deep into the earth, below the frost line. The ground itself would be its insulation. The air inside would be still, protected from the relentless wind. She did not feel relief. She did not feel joy. She felt a profound and quiet sense of recognition, as if she had been walking toward this place her entire life without knowing it. She slowly descended the stone steps, her hand brushing against the cold, damp rock. She reached the dirt floor and stood in the center of the small, dark space. Fenrir padded down after her, sniffing the corners. Abigail dropped to her knees. She placed her palm flat against the earthen floor. It was cold, but it was solid. It was a place that could be held against the storm. She felt something she had no word for, except right. The work began with subtraction. The cellar was half filled with the debris of its own collapse, rotten timbers, clumps of sod, and the slow accumulation of dirt and leaves over decades. She had no shovel. She had her cast iron skillet. For 3 days, from the first grey light of dawn until her muscles screamed in the twilight, she dug. She used the heavy pan to scoop and scrape, filling her burlap sack with the debris, hauling it up the stone steps, and dumping it outside. Fenrir, sensing the purpose in her labor, would help, digging with his paws, whining with excitement as he unearthed the damp, peaty smell of the deep earth. Her hands, already chapped by the cold, were rubbed raw. Blisters formed, broke, and bled. She ignored them. The pain was a distant signal from a body that was now simply a tool for the task at hand. When the floor was clear, she had a stone-lined room, roughly 10 feet by 12 feet, with a dirt floor and an open ceiling. The sky was her roof. That had to change. She had a small hatchet Thomas had kept for trimming branches. Its handle was smooth, its blade still sharp. She walked the creek bed, her eye searching not for firewood, but for structure. She found a stand of young cottonwoods, no thicker than her wrist. Felling them was exhausting work. Each swing of the hatchet sent a jarring shock up her arm. She would chop until her breath came in ragged gasps, then rest, her back against a tree, Fenrir watching her with patient, intelligent eyes. She dragged the saplings back to the cellar one by one. She laid them across the top of the stone walls, creating a lattice of pale wood. This was the skeleton. For the skin, she used the earth itself. She cut thick squares of prairie sod, the tangled roots making them strong and cohesive. She packed them tightly over the branches, grass side down. Then, she mixed clay from the creek bed with dry grass and water, creating a thick, heavy daub. She plastered this over the sod, filling every crack, every gap, creating a thick, earthen shell. It was not a roof. It was a hill she had pulled over herself. She left a small opening in the center, covered by a piece of stretched hide from a rabbit Fenrir had caught. It was not a window, but it let in a sliver of daylight. The greatest challenge was fire. Warmth was life, but smoke was a slow death in an enclosed space. She needed a chimney. She studied the stone walls, looking for a weakness, a place to build. In one corner, a few stones were loose. She worked them free, creating an opening near the top of the wall. For the chimney itself, she gathered flat stones from the creek bed, stacking them, using her clay and grass mortar to seal the joints. It was slow, painstaking work. Each stone had to be fitted, balanced, and sealed. The flue was narrow and crooked, but it rose a few feet above her new sod roof. She built the hearth on the floor beneath it, a small semicircle of stones. The first fire was a moment of terror and hope. She used the last of her matches to light a small bundle of dry grass. The kindling caught. Smoke billowed out, filling the small space, stinging her eyes, making her cough. Fenrir whined, retreating to the far corner. For a moment, she thought she had failed, that she had built her own tomb. Then, she saw it. A faint, wavering movement in the smoke. A draft. Slowly, reluctantly, the column of grey began to draw upward, pulling toward the opening she had made. The smoke thinned, then cleared, a steady stream now rising through her makeshift chimney. She knelt before the small, flickering flames, the first real warmth she had felt in weeks. It was more than heat. It was proof. It was the first meal that felt like it belonged to a home, the first night that felt like a victory. Her food was what the land offered. She learned the taste of every edible root, the bitter tang of burdock, the starchy satisfaction of cattail tubers. Fenrir was a silent, efficient hunter. He would return with rabbits, squirrels, even a prairie chicken, laying them at her feet without ceremony. She wasted nothing. The meat was food. The hides were clothing and blankets, scraped clean with a sharp piece of slate and softened with animal brains. The bones were tools. She sharpened a leg bone into an awl, using it to stitch hides together with sinew. One day, a figure appeared on the ridge. A young woman, moving with a quiet grace that seemed part of the landscape itself. She was not from the settlement. Her hair was long and black, her face framed by the fur of a wolf pelt. She carried a bow. She stopped 100 yards from the cellar, watching. Abigail stood at the entrance, her hand resting on Fenrir's head to keep him from barking. They stood like that for a long time, two women on the edge of a world that had discarded them both. The woman, whose name she would learn was Sora, finally walked forward. She pointed to the wisp of smoke rising from Abigail's chimney. She said nothing, but her eyes held a look of recognition. Sora became a quiet teacher. She spoke little English, but they communicated through action. She showed Abigail how to build better snares, how to find the dried puffball mushrooms that could carry an ember for hours, how to read the clouds not for rain, but for the weight of the snow they carried. Sora had knowledge that was not written in any almanac. It was written in the land itself. She never asked about Abigail's past. She seemed to understand that they were both survivors of a world that had tried to erase them. The skepticism of the world found her eventually. A trapper, following his line, saw the smoke and came to investigate. He peered down into her cellar, at her neat stacks of firewood, her drying herbs, her sleeping dog. He laughed. Living like a badger in a hole, he said, shaking his head. He rode to the settlement and told the story. She became a piece of local lore. The Cellar Witch. The mad widow of Juniper Creek. They said she would be dead by Christmas, another victim of the prairie's unforgiving nature. The storekeeper who sold the trapper his ammunition shook his head and said the woman was tempting Providence. The preacher warned his flock about those who turned their back on community and sought shelter in the dark places of the earth. They spoke of her as if she were already a ghost. Then the blizzard came. It was not a storm. It was a white wall that erased the world. For 6 days, the wind screamed, and the snow fell, piling into drifts 20 feet high. The settlement was cut off. Families huddled in their homes, rationing food and firewood, listening to the wind tear at their roofs. But in her cellar, Abigail was safe. The wind howled harmlessly over her earthen roof. She had a store of dried meat and roots. She had a neat stack of firewood that reached the ceiling. She and Fenrir lay by the small, steady fire, listening to the storm rage. The blizzard that was supposed to be her end was her vindication. The world had vanished, and she was still here. When the snow finally stopped and a pale, watery sun emerged, the world was a study in silence and white. The settlement was buried. Roads were gone. Barns had collapsed under the weight of the snow. For 2 weeks, there was no contact with the outside world. When a path was finally cleared, the news that trickled out was grim. The trapper who had laughed at her was found frozen in a drift, less than a mile from town. Several families were suffering from frostbite and hunger. The community's confidence had been buried under the snow. One afternoon, a figure appeared, struggling through the deep drifts. It was Marcus. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished. The prairie had stripped him of his town-bought certainty. His face was gaunt, his eyes holding a haunted, desperate look. The hardness in him had gone soft in all the wrong places. He stood before the entrance to her cellar, his breath pluming in the frigid air. Fenrir stood beside her, a low rumble in his chest, but he did not move. Marcus did not look at her directly. He looked at the smoke curling from her chimney, at the neatly butchered deer carcass hanging from a tree branch, at the sheer, undeniable fact of her survival. He spoke of the hardship in the settlement, of his wife's persistent cough, of the 2 cows that had frozen in his barn. He talked about his dwindling supply of feed for the remaining livestock. It was not an apology. It was a report of his own failure, delivered to the one person who had every right to savor it. Abigail listened without expression. When he was finished, the silence stretched between them, thick and cold. She did not gloat. She did not remind him of his words, of his judgment. The wind and the snow had already made that speech for her. Her response was not emotional. It was logistical. "How many head of cattle are left?" she asked. The question seemed to startle him. He stammered, 5. "And a calf. Do you have a sled?" "A small one," he said. She turned and went back down into her home. She returned with 2 large burlap sacks. One was filled with dried cattail roots, a starchy food she knew could be ground into a coarse flour to supplement the cattle's feed. The other contained pine needles, willow bark, and dried yarrow. She told him how to boil them into a tea for his wife's cough, a remedy she had learned from Sora. She gave him instructions, her voice calm and even, as if she were explaining a recipe. She was not offering charity. She was solving a problem. He took the sacks, his hands clumsy. He could not meet her eyes. He had come expecting to beg, perhaps to be turned away. He did not know what to do with this quiet, practical competence. As he turned to leave, he stopped. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He pressed it into her hand. "This was Thomas's," he mumbled. "It should be yours." He left without another word. Inside the pouch was a single silver dollar and a tarnished silver locket. It had belonged to their mother, a piece of family history he had claimed along with the farm. It was not a thank you. It was a return of stolen property. It was the only apology he was capable of giving. It was enough. Standing there in the snow, she looked down at the locket, then back at his retreating figure. She did not feel triumph. She felt the quiet, steady peace of a circle closing. She had not needed his permission to survive, and she did not need his gratitude to be generous. Years passed. The cellar became the heart of a small, thriving homestead. Abigail never moved. She expanded, digging another room, building a small, sturdy barn into the side of the hill for a milk goat and some chickens. Sora and her growing family became her neighbors, their lives intertwined with the seasons. People from the settlement, humbled by that first great blizzard and other hard seasons that followed, began to make the trek to her homestead. They did not come for forgiveness or for wisdom. They came for her winter-hardy squash seeds, for her knowledge of which wild herbs could break a fever, for the simple, undeniable proof that one could make a home where none was supposed to exist. She taught anyone who came, not with sermons, but by putting a tool in their hands and showing them the work. She died on a warm afternoon in late September, decades later. She was sitting in a chair she had built from cartonwood, a blanket across her lap, looking out over the rolling hills. A cup of chicory tea was still warm on the table beside her. A descendant of Fenrir was asleep at her feet. Sora's granddaughter was in the garden, singing softly as she harvested the last of the tomatoes. In Abigail's lap was an open seed packet, filled with the dark, heavy seeds of a new strain of corn she had developed, one that could withstand an early frost. Her face, etched with the lines of a long and useful life, looked like that of a person who had just finished a very satisfying book. Her headstone, a simple field stone placed by Sora's children, bore only 6 words. Abigail Hale. She made the earth keep its promises. Perhaps you have a sealed door in your own life. A place you were cast out of, a gift you possess that the world told you was a flaw. Perhaps there is a cellar, an overlooked foundation, that you have been standing outside of, afraid of the darkness, afraid of the work it would take to clean it out and build a roof over it. You have the tools you need. They may look like a simple skillet, a worn book, a quiet loyalty. The ground beneath your feet is honest. It is waiting for you to listen, to begin the work of building a space that the world cannot take from you. It is waiting for you to claim it. The small bone needle she found that first day was a tool for weaving winter mats from rushes, a craft known only to Sora's people. True shelter is not a gift you are given. It is a space you claim and build with your own two hands. If you believe the most powerful stories are found in the quietest places, subscribe for more like this. Our next story is about a lighthouse keeper who discovered a language in the waves.